Design Workshop number 2. My name is Kevin Bacon. I am the Director of the Office of Design for the Department of City Planning for the City of Atlanta. Really excited to have you all joining us on a Monday evening tonight. As a second part of the activities that we'll be talking about tonight, we've got a really exciting panel presentation we've titled our Great Streets Forum to talk about kind of the nitty gritty of what it takes to really get into public space design, knowing that public spaces, designing them and building them is really just the beginning. Before we get into all of that, I was going to take us through a little bit of background on the project for those of you that are joining us for the first time and may not be familiar, and this will be useful for the other events that we have planned for this week as well. Meg, if you don't mind, go to the next slide. There we go. The project for Peachtree really started a number of years ago in 2016, shortly after the Atlanta City Studio, our pop-up urban design studio for the Department of City Planning, was opened. One of the very first projects that we took on in talking about Peachtree Street, understanding that I'm sure many of you may have asked the same question before standing on Peachtree. It's our main street, and why doesn't it quite feel like that every day? Certainly, pre-pandemic, you can point to certain events, whether it's Dragon Con or Streets Alive or any other of the big things that happen in downtown. And at times it does have a lot of activity and vibrancy, but if you compare Atlanta to other major cities, why don't we have that type of activity every day? And so how do we think about the redesign of that street, not something for cars, just for cars, but for people? And so that's where really started this project. Next slide, please. We're in the context of this project, we're really talking about a stretch even bigger than what you're seeing here from North Avenue to Marietta Street. But one of the things that we really wanted to focus on, knowing that section of Peachtree, about a mile and a half, has different characters and different opportunities, different challenges, really wanted to focus in on where a public space redesign would really bring the most benefit to Peachtree. And the original proposal for this was looking at about 5 blocks around Peachtree Center, from Hardy Ivy Park south to the Georgia Pacific Plaza and Margaret Mitchell Square. It's about a half-mile walking distance. You have a lot of the existing businesses, Peachtree Center there, and great access to the MARTA Transit Center. Through there was a lot of conversation about how do we enable better cross-grain access and accommodate different users. And we really got into this idea of not necessarily how do we segregate the street space more for different users, adding bike lanes or scooter lanes or whatever else may be, what other transit innovation may come in future generations, but how do we just get back to designing spaces for people? And we really got into this idea for shared spaces. They're just starting to really start to see some case studies in the United States, and there's certainly several of these abroad, and you can see these on the screen. On Friday, with one of our panel speakers, we really had an opportunity to get into the history and the experience of Bell Street in Seattle, and really understanding that no two shared spaces are exactly the same. That and thinking about how they handle materials and change the relationship to the curb and where vehicles may go and pedestrians may be protected, that there's a lot of nuance in thinking about those. And so we spent a lot of time looking at different examples and seeing what may be applied, knowing there's never a perfect one-to-one, let's copy this design and put it here, but really looking for something that would be Atlanta's authentic interpretation of that. Next slide. So in 2018, for those of you that may be familiar with this or not, in the Atlanta Streets Alive Central in September of 2018, we shared our first thinking of this, a concept design of what Peachtree could look like as a shared space. You're seeing one of those images here of standing at about the mall at Peachtree Center, looking north towards the Carnegie Monument, and ideas borrowed from many of the case studies, thinking about materials and delineation of where cars might go and where people would be allowed to move freely, and could there be parking, and maybe there are even trees on Peachtree Street, and where else could we have areas for programming and seating. And so we've really started with this project, the Peachtree Shared Space Study, to take that work forward to something that's on a pathway towards implementation, of really getting into the details of understanding the design and refining it, and really starting the engagement process, and even demonstrating aspects of that. Next slide. As I mentioned at the beginning, design is really just the start of this, and Atlanta's really, I would say, relearning what it takes to really design exceptional public spaces, and part of that is operating them, maintaining them, and really understanding, how that all plays out in design. We've learned from some of the other public space projects that we've done that there's a lot of work that goes into public spaces, and you can see kind of, if we're talking about making a great street, what some of those things are, whether it's beautiful architecture on either side, stormwater management, and green infrastructure, and thinking about landscaping, and how do we make spaces that are supportive of businesses. And so what we really wanted to do is gather speakers and professionals that have experience in this arena from other areas of the country, and have worked on these similar projects before, to really help us understand, beyond just a beautiful design for Peachtree Street, really what it takes collaboratively for us as a city to really both implement this project and be able to collectively own it and take care of it, and use it and think through that. Some of those topics we're going to touch on tonight will be, one, just the important transportation shift from streets of just being for cars or moving vehicles, but as places for moving people, and an experience of downtowns. Talking about activation and maintenance of these public spaces. Stormwater management and green infrastructure, and lastly, but certainly not the least important, is a discussion on equity, and what that means for public space. Beyond just saying that we're designing public spaces for all people, what are the deeper questions that we really need to challenge ourselves when we're thinking about design? So we're fortunate that we have 4 outstanding speakers tonight that we just spent the last couple of hours together touring Peachtree Street virtually, and looking at some of the design work that we'll be proposing with all of you later this week, and excited to bring them here. Our moderator is going to introduce those, and I'm about to introduce our moderator. Before I do that, I do want to do just one housekeeping announcement. For those of you that were with us for Bell Street on Friday, unfortunately, we had our first Zoom crashing event of the pandemic, and it was not a pleasant experience for any of us. We apologize for that. Certainly, the things that were posted or that happened in that period do not reflect at all the opinions and views of the Department of City Planning. We worked quickly to try to triage the situation. We shut the platform down and restarted. And for this meeting tonight, you'll probably notice several new measures we put in place to hopefully have a non-disrupted experience. If for some reason we do have an issue, and we aren't able to resolve it in the midst of the presentation, we will do the same thing that we did before. We will shut it down, purge out the bad actors, and restart the presentation, and you can rejoin us using the same link. But hopefully we will have a smooth flow tonight, and that will be guided by our moderator, Vanessa Lira, who is an assistant director for our Office of Design and Department of City Planning. Specifically, she leads our public space studio, which you may recognize as right now being synonymous with the Atlanta City Studio, located at 99 Broad Street, so in South Downtown. Vanessa was a founding member of the Atlanta City Studio, so she and I have been working side by side since 2016. And in fact, one of the first things that we worked on with many others was the original concept for this idea for Peachtree. Vanessa continues to lead a lot of the public space work that we are working on collaboratively, particularly with Central Atlanta Progress, as well as others in downtown and South Downtown, particularly the Broad Street pedestrian plaza, or the boardwalk as it gets referred to, improvements to South Broad, as well as many other places in downtown. She also leads the team in the studio that is really working on public space throughout the city through our placemaking program, which we will be rebranding and relaunching here in the next few months. That includes work really throughout the city, bringing public space improvements and design to neighborhoods such as Grant Park, East Atlanta, Chosewood Park, Sylvan Hills, West End. We could go on, and we're looking forward to expanding that reach here in the coming year. Vanessa is an architect. She graduated with her master's in Architecture in Georgia Tech in 2016, just before joining the studio. And I am just thankful to have her as a very reliable right hand and skilled designer in the studio, and pleased to have her moderating tonight. So thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you to all of our panel speakers. And I will turn it over to you, Vanessa.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Kevin. We're so excited to have the expertise of our panelists today, and they'll each be giving us a short presentation about their work, and after that presentation, we'll go into our discussion. But before we get started, I want to introduce you to the panel. So our first presentation is going to be from Amalia Layton Cody. She's a civil engineer, planner, and director of Tools Design Seattle office. She works with municipal agencies and their partners to manage transportation and parks projects that emphasize mobility, social equity, and community enhancement. She's valued for her emphasis on implementation, including maintenance and operations. As the engineer of record for the Bell Street Share Space in Seattle, she's an expert on the ins and outs of designing and permitting a first-of-its-kind space in a major city. She also served as the chair of the City of Seattle's Planning Commission and is a contributing author of NACTO Urban Street Stormwater Guide, as well as Seattle Streets Illustrated Update, which focused on the integration of green stormwater and infrastructure into the streetscape. Her projects often include roadway and intersection design, stormwater management, ADA requirements, traffic calming, and utility infrastructure relocation. Amelia received her Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Washington in 2002, and she lives in Seattle with her husband and daughters. We're also going to be hearing from Tara Green. Tara is an OJB's Principal of Program Development. She leads OJB's new office in Dallas and focuses on developing the firm's park planning and programming initiatives. Prior to joining the firm in 2018, she was president of the Clyde Warren Park for 5 years, turning it into a world-class model for successful public-private partnerships. As president of the park, Tara was responsible for keeping Dallas's most active green space a pristine and safe environment for the 1 million guests who visit it each year. She guided the strategic direction of the park and worked to generate operating capital for the nonprofit, which receives no municipal funding. She oversaw staff and operations, including 1,300 free activities offered throughout the year. Tara has worked in downtown Dallas for more than 20 years and enjoyed seeing the thousands of visitors who came through the park every week. She also brings years of experience from her past roles in the sports industry and in venue management. She was a chief revenue officer at the American Airlines Center, vice president and chief operating officer at the North Texas Super Bowl 45 host committee, and vice president of sports marketing for the Dallas Convention and Visitors Bureau. Aside from her professional experience, Tara is committed to serving the city of Dallas, where she is active in many community organizations. She serves on the board of directors in Downtown Dallas Association, Dallas Art District, Uptown Dallas Inc., and the McKinney Avenue Project, Trolley, She completed 2 terms as the chairwoman of the Dallas Sports Commission and served on the board of Visit Dallas. Tara is also a past chairwoman for the National Association of Sports Commission and has earned her Certified Sports Event Executive designation. She's a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a bachelor's degree in international studies. She also earned a master's degree in sports administration from Ohio University. Tara currently lives in Capel with her husband Lamar and their 2 children, Wiley and Sydney. After Tara, we're going to hear from Emily Weidenhoff. Emily is the Director of Public Space at the New York Department of Transportation, working closely with community groups throughout the 5 boroughs to reimagine their streets as public space. She has been focusing on the role of the public realm in strengthening communities for over a decade and is deeply involved in policy, management, legislation, and most recently in shaping open streets, open restaurants, and other uses of streets to support New Yorkers during the COVID pandemic and as a part of the recovery ahead. Emily has worked as an architect and urban designer in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, including the New York City Department of City Planning. She has researched and edited 2 publications with the Earth Institute at Columbia University on the potential impacts of natural gas extraction on the Upper Delaware community and on strategies for maintaining sustainable agriculture in the Catskill region. She has researched and lectured on the importance of open space in the holes in Dharavi in Mumbai, India, and the role of streets in public space in preserving cultural heritage in a rapidly developing Asian city such as Hong Kong. Emily received her Bachelor of Architecture from Pennsylvania State University and her Master of Science in Architecture and Urban Design from Columbia University, where she was an adjunct assistant professor of architecture, teaching the MSAUD studio from 2009 to 2013. We're also joined by Tamika Butler. Tamika is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. As principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, she focuses on shining a light on inequality, inequity, and social justice. Most recently, she was Tools Design California Planning Director, and Director of Equity and Inclusion. Previously, Tamika served as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in poor communities across greater Los Angeles. She has a diverse background in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. Tamika received her JD from Stanford Law School and received her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Bachelor of Science in Sociology from Creighton University in her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. She lives in Los Angeles with her wife and son. With that, I would like to pass it on to our first presenter. I believe it's Amalia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My presentation is going to focus on stormwater management and green infrastructure. Next slide. So one of the things that we've seen in the past year is that weather is not preventing people from using our parks, open spaces, and streetscapes. However, next slide, things aren't always positive. And I think one of the things that has impacted many of our communities across the country is storm events that historically happened every 100 years or every 500 years are happening more frequently, and people are becoming more aware of water movement and what happens in our community when we don't manage our stormwater in a sustainable, resilient way. Next slide. The important thing about streets is many streets elements actually also function as stormwater elements. As you can see here, a curb is really conveying and channelizing water and keeping it where it needs to go so that the vehicles can move and the pedestrians have a place to walk. Next slide. We often forget about infrastructure under the ground, and much of our stormwater is managed underground until it isn't, until we have some sort of failure in our systems that causes the stormwater to surface in ways, again, that prevent our movement and use of public space. Next slide. So what does this mean for Peachtree? Thinking about Atlanta and thinking about how it rains in Atlanta and how we're gonna potentially change this street in various ways. What are their opportunities to manage stormwater in a more natural way that fits in line with many of the policies that the city has related to being having more trees and more natural areas and having people have nature in the city. Next slide. So green infrastructure is not new to Atlanta. There is a program that is looking at ways to integrate various kinds of green infrastructure. One of the things that we're going to focus on in this presentation is more of the engineered green infrastructure, so not large natural systems, but things that are more often found in urban environments and retrofit situations. Next slide. So Atlanta has got some really cool projects related to green infrastructure that have received national recognition. One of them is Old Fort Ward Park. And this is really highlights how green infrastructure can be an amenity and how it can really help foster redevelopment and really activate a space, but also really have a very keen utility function and prevent flooding. What we're going to talk about on Peachtree is something that's a lot smaller of a scale, but just to give you a sense of that this is something that really is not new to Atlanta. Next slide. So one of the things that's been happening parallel to our process is downtown Atlanta has been looking at a stormwater master plan and identifying opportunities for stormwater integration into the public rights of way and parks based on historical water patterns, where the creeks are and where the drainage basins are. And one thing to highlight about Peachtree is that it's a ridge road. So it's actually that's happening, it's at the very top. So the benefit is water is moving away from Peachtree in general rather than coming towards Peachtree. And so this provides something when we start to think about systems as a whole, how this street can function in parallel to other streets. Maybe this street takes on more of the public open space while other streets carry more of the stormwater utility piece. Next slide. So as was mentioned, I had the opportunity to be the co-author for the Urban Street Stormwater Guide. And as one of my roles on that project was to facilitate conversations with stormwater management folks and transportation folks from across the country that were NACDO members that were struggling with competing goals and barriers within their organizations to integrate stormwater management into streets. And so this guide really provides the foundations for cities to say that small interventions can actually provide the multiple benefits of creating spaces that manage stormwater, and then also are really integrated into the urban design framework of our city streets and public open spaces. Next slide. And so when we think about conceptual designs, we think about ways that we can use green infrastructure to manage stormwater in the surface that can provide barriers, positive barriers, so separating people from traffic, showing people where to go, integrating trees, and thinking about how all these things can fit together in the same space. Next slide. And so one of the things I want to highlight is, what does this look like on the ground? What are some examples? And so I'm going to go through a couple great streets, if you will, that have all modes acknowledged, and I'm going to point out some green infrastructure elements in these projects. So this project is Western Avenue in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this bike lane is actually a permeable asphalt. And so the water that is managed runoff from the street and from the sidewalk go into this infrastructure and are infiltrating it into the ground, into a system in a different way than was before. Next slide. Here's an example from Pratt Street in Baltimore, Maryland, where green infrastructure is providing some separation from the vehicular movement and pedestrian space. And one thing I also want to point out is that it's providing an opportunity to make some grade changes to acknowledge the fact that you may have existing buildings that have different entryway or elevations you have to match at the doors than where you need to meet your roadway elevations. Next slide. Capital City Bikeway in St. Paul, Minnesota also is an example of a bike facility that has used permeable asphalt as a way to delineate the bike facility and manage that. In this case, it was also helped with snow management. When the snow melted, it didn't freeze on the bike facility. And you can see to the right that there are some green infrastructure elements where water is brought in from the curb lane and brought into those areas where it's infiltrating into the ground, into the landscape buffer. Next slide. This is a project in Portland, Oregon called Haslow on 8th. And this is an example where multiple block development actually integrated green infrastructure into the right-of-way that benefited not only the public open space, but also contributed to private development using some of the public right-of-way for their stormwater management. And that was a benefit to the developers because they didn't have to do everything on site. Next slide. And then this is an example of a more natural look to green infrastructure. This is a creek tributary in Seattle, Washington. That's really more of a swale or a less engineered, if you will. It still has some weirs and some very hardened elements, if you will, but it's a much more natural approach. Next slide. And then I wanted to highlight some of the conversations. Emily's going to bring up some things that we now have to think about in our roadway design. How do we start, if we're having shared spaces and bringing people into the right-of-way, there's been unfortunate incidences where people feel vulnerable because of vehicles being able to move into spaces at speeds which are not safe for pedestrians. And so we have to think about this. And so there's opportunity to integrate our stormwater management as this. This is an example of a street that I helped do the conceptual design for in Kirkland, Washington, where you can see that you have these open bioretention areas, which are filtering the water into the ground, but they are protecting also the businesses and the pedestrian space by having an open area that a vehicle would have to go into. And then it also has a barrier on the inside as well. Next slide. Another thing I just want to highlight is pervious pavements are still, while they may not be green, they still contribute to green infrastructure, and they can be used as an urban design element as well as for the utility purpose of stormwater management. Next slide. And I just want to highlight, often people want to use bollards on shared spaces, and bollards sometimes have a great place, and if it's deemed necessary, they can be integrated as ways to also protect the green infrastructure and think about other opportunities to delineate parking areas. This is an example where there's a bioretention facility, and actually underneath this is a series of silvicells, which is providing more soil volume for those trees in those areas. So what could look very small and very detailed could actually have a much wider footprint under the ground. Next slide. And then there's just different ways to do curb cuts to convey the water into these planting areas. Next slide. And a key piece to consider that we looked at, particularly for the NACTO guide, and we think about in all of our projects, is how does this tie into accessibility with people being directed where to go and having protection so that they're not moving into a space that is going to cause them harm to their bodies, or that they'll know that what path of travel that they need to continue down on. And so there's different ways to separate people from green infrastructure elements. Next slide. And then also just how you manage the water to protect shared spaces or more of a plaza-like space. Oftentimes we'll think about trench drains or other drains, but those also have to be accessible elements, making sure that those meet those openings, have to manage the amount of water coming to them, but also have to be safe and meet accessibility requirements so people don't harm themselves when crossing those features as well. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that at the concept level, we think about things and we draw cross sections, but we don't always think about what else is underground. You can see these two cross sections don't show any of the other utilities or any of the other elements that are underground features that we talk about. And I just strongly encourage all projects to think about the other utilities. When you look at Peachtree, you see lots of vaults and other things that have a much larger footprint than what we can see on the surface. Next slide. And the constructability of these items are why they seem complicated. There's a lot of good resources about them, not only in the city of Atlanta, but across the country, of how these things work and operate and are really functional. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that in one of the most urban areas, the city of New York, that gets a lot of different weather patterns, has really put forth a huge effort to integrate green storm infrastructure at many scales. And this map is just showing what they're doing that's in construction, has been designed, and has already been constructed. And you can actually interactively look on this map. And what I just want to highlight is sometimes even the small intervention is so beneficial, and that I think New York and has highlighted that, and that the maintenance of those there's a lot of information about how they maintain those systems depending on where they are in the city. Next slide. And I'm going to stop there, and I just want to say sometimes the simplest elements can be considered green infrastructure. This is a local piece of green infrastructure in my neighborhood that some plants have found their way to grow in a harsh environment. So I think the thing to remember is that these things want to thrive, and they can thrive in harsh environments, and we just need to create the space for them to do so. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. This is Tara, and I'm going to talk about activation and maintenance. And while I work for a landscape architecture firm, I just want to remind you, I am not a landscape architect. So Amalia is amazing. The science behind her work is fantastic. Her engineering, that's not me. I'm going to talk about boots on the streets, practical approach. While our firm does get involved in all the things that she talked about, I'm going to stick to what we want to talk about today, activating green space. And we have become really hyper aware of the importance of green space. And I think this is one of those hidden opportunities that this pandemic has afforded us, is that people recognize the value of green space and the importance. And I hope we'll think about adding that to our future designs for many reasons. You can go to the next slide, please. And one of those reasons is simply mental and physical health. Peachtree Street, let's add trees to the street. It has a lot of benefits, including some of the things that Amalia talked about, stormwater management, but also improving our overall air quality. Just living and being around nature improves our outlook, getting active. If you can go to the next slide, please. But it also affects our urban ecosystems. And Amalia did a great job kind of explaining all the different ways that can do that. But think about urban conservation as well. Can we introduce pollinators? Can we introduce other species that need to be in downtown to create a holistic ecosystem? And then go to the next slide. And Tamika is going to do an outstanding job kind of explaining to you about equity, but we believe that access to green space is something that is an equitable right for everyone. Access to parks, access to equitable funding to build those spaces, access to local culture, and bringing that culture to life in an open space is incredibly important and creates a well-balanced community. So you can go on to the next slide, please. That's great. We understand the importance of green space, but how do you activate it? Why do you activate it? Ultimately, it's to create community, to create shared experiences, not only with the people who live, work, and play in this area, but people that you want to come visit. You've got a natural tourist destination along Peachtree Street. How do we make sure everyone that's interacting on this area feels welcome, feels invited, feels included, and there's something to see and do for everyone? Next slide, please. So why would you do it? Every community has their own why. And it's not just one answer, it's lots of answers. And this committee, this team has done a fantastic job of identifying the vision and the goals for this space, but ultimately activating a space will bring it to life. Next slide, please. Think of it as your palette. You've got a beautiful canvas with this new design that you can paint a masterpiece with. What are the pieces and parts that you're going to use? It's really a combination of two things. What are the amenities, the program elements? What are the design moves that will give people a reason to visit the space over and over, that draws them in to visit time and again, combined with what are the intentional, scheduled, curated activities, opportunities, business opportunities, retail opportunities, whatever it may be, that changes, that gives you a reason to set your watch to come to this space, but also gives you surprise and delight that you didn't know those things were taking place. You just found them while you're moving along this space. Next slide, please. And so when you're looking at building a curated activation calendar, you really want to think of it like a pyramid. What's the base? What are those daily, weekly, monthly elements? What are those amenities you put in place? What are those things that you can just count on are going to be taking place on a regular basis, layered in with kind of the seasonal events that might take place along Peachtree Street? Could any of these be revenue drivers? Could you drive revenue to cover these operating costs? What are the signature events? What are the big community gatherings where you could block off the whole section and do something on a large scale? We're going to do those again. I'm convinced of it. This pandemic is not going to last forever. We're going to get back together again, but we're going to have safe spaces outdoors in order to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So you look at it as a kind of a balanced approach. You want things that create stickiness. What causes people to linger longer? Shade, beautiful infrastructure, sidewalks. How do you move easily? How do you have great sight lines? Music. Can we create a warm, welcoming environment? Can we create, is there a water story to tell? Can you enjoy a fountain? How do you move freely through this space? And what causes you to go from one space to the next? Those sight lines are so important because it draws your eye. It makes you want to traverse the length of the space as well. But you also want to see who are the people using it? Who are the people that are the built-in natural audience? But also, who do you want to attract that's not already built in? And how do you create that diversity of movement with those different audiences? Next slide, please. And so what could those look like? Food truck festivals, farmers markets, movie nights, those year-round activities that showcase local businesses, that give an opportunity for makers and entrepreneurs and artists to be spotlighted, but also to bring people together for a shared experience, bring a diverse audience together to do something fun they might not otherwise do together. Next slide. And then you start thinking about building community. And I think that is the core of why you would take on activation, is to create the brand, the energy, the excitement around this stretch of Peachtree Street. And it can be a place where everybody coexists. And I mean everybody, meaning cars, bikes, people, diverse audiences, etc. Next slide, please. Lifestyle. You want to think about your activation in a couple of big buckets. You want to do like health and wellness program. You want to think about arts and culture programming. You want to think about music. You want to think about education. Can you do things? Can the community showcase their knowledge, their skills, their talents in this space by providing amenities or access to opportunities or teaching classes, sharing their knowledge and wisdom in different ways along these spaces? Next slide. And technology, we're all connected. So how do we make that easy for people in these spaces? Can we offer them solar recharging stations? Can we offer them amenities that where perhaps we could work outside together? We could create work pods. We could create spaces to bring meetings outdoors. Let's get out of our fluorescent lights and into the outdoors. And there may be opportunities for that along the design. Next slide. And gatherings, talked about that a little earlier. It kind of goes along with creating a sense of community. Next slide. And temporary art installations. I think these are incredibly powerful activators, especially if you do them in some kind of regularity. It's like, what's new? What's different? What's going to cause me to come back? What is that Instagram moment? We're all looking for the hashtag thing to amplify the voice of the space through social media. Give people a reason to come check it out. Create that word of mouth buzz. Next slide. And gaming, little elements that you can place for people to do for free. They're just there. They're available in the park. They're available as you move throughout the space. They could be outside a restaurant or a patio area. Creating more depth and width to do these kind of activations along the sidewalk are incredibly important. Next slide. And then obviously, if you're looking for revenue generation opportunities, you're looking for ways to acknowledge those that have helped fund it. So different ways to attribute the donors or the corporate sponsors that have helped bring these things to life. Next slide. And so here are just a couple of images of where that has happened. Where has design with activation in mind worked? This is the park in Dallas where I worked. Vanessa mentioned that we did 1,300 free programs and events annually, generated over 1 million people in attendance annually, and it was free to the public. Everything was free except for the food and beverage that you purchased on site. So, but free is not free to the folks that operate the park. Next slide. And that's where we talk about operations and maintenance. Levy Park, another public-private partnership to build a park in Midtown Houston, took an existing space and renovated a park. In Dallas, Clyde Warren Park was literally built out of thin air. It was engineered over a freeway. It decked over a chasm that the freeway created when it was built, much like your Stitch opportunity in Atlanta. In Levy Park, economic development was sparked because of this park. We've seen it in our project in Omaha. We've seen it in our project in Greensboro, North Carolina, in Dallas, in Houston. Economic development is sparked by the increase in green space. It's a retention tool. It's a recruitment tool. Businesses use it to drive new talent to come in. And so think of it as creating green space, but also think of it as a way to enhance economic impact as well as social and physical impact. Next slide, please. And this is a mixed use development that's also a stormwater infrastructure story. It's a way to manage floodwater in Houston. It's also a way to connect businesses around a shared green space. And so Amelia pointed out so beautifully, infrastructure and green infrastructure and resiliency can be an amenity. Embrace that, lean into it, because it does create a lot of ripple effects that you probably weren't even thinking about. Next slide. And we saw those same ripple effects at our project in Oklahoma City. We did Myriad Gardens, did a renovation. We also looked at their streetscape. How do we create smart streets? How do we create shared spaces? How do we create improved stormwater management and a resilient infrastructure that can tell a holistic story across all of downtown? Next slide, please. All that's great, but how do you operate it? How do you maintain it? And so every solution is authentic to its own community. You need your own champions. Next slide. And you need your own business model. It could be a public-private partnership. It could be publicly funded, publicly managed. The funds to build it and the funds to operate and maintain it, you need to identify both sources and uses, because it's one thing to build it, but then you want to make sure that you have an entity in place that's dedicated to managing that space. Active spaces require active management. I think it's really important to be intentional about that process. Next slide. And then you think about revenue. How are you going to pay for it? Next slide, please. And there's some basic buckets for building a park. And the next slide, there are some basic buckets for covering the revenue to operate those parks. And so these are the basic streams. There's permutations and derivations of all these things, but these are the kind of the high level ways to make those things happen. And each space has an opportunity to address what does it want to do? Where does it want to be in this opportunity of solutions and revenue generation? Next slide. And then you think about the entity that manages the space. It could be a combination of things. It could be existing entities already in place. It could be a new entities that's created. It could be a partnership with the city and the Parks Department. It could be all of those things. It just has to be authentic to Atlanta and to this part of Atlanta to maximize the best opportunity. And don't let all this list of events scare you, or list of expenses, because it's scalable. That's one of the things I want you to remember. Your level of activity, your level of investment, your level of funds needed to activate a space, it's all scalable. And the more the community is invested in this from an ownership standpoint, the more that they are brought to life to activate it themselves with their activities, their talents, their businesses, the better it is for everyone. And then there's a natural life cycle to a space. Next slide, please. Year one, you're drinking from a fire hose, trying to figure it out. By year three, you're starting to figure out what normal looks like. You've got a little background data. You're starting to understand your demographics. And by year five, you realize how to operate, how to make this thing sing and dance the way you want to. So I would leave you with the idea of, why do you want to activate a space? Next slide, please. You want to create economic development. You want to create a destination. You want to create and enhance your sense of community. And ultimately, it's about shared experiences. You want people to go away saying, that was the coolest space I've ever been to. Can you believe what they did with Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta? It's remarkable. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Weidenhoff. Really excited to be here with you all today. I'm going to share a little bit about the kind of evolved thinking that we have done at the New York City Department of Transportation along Broadway, which is one very prominent corridor in New York City, and kind of the shifting and evolving paradigms over time. My team is tasked with working with community members to reimagine our streets as public space. And if you go to the next slide, about 12 years ago, we looked at this stretch of the corridor from Union Square to Columbus Circle along Broadway, and looked to change the way we saw this street. If you go to the next slide, this effort, Greenlight for Midtown, created a series of premier global public spaces along the corridor, really pearls, gems along a necklace. Over the past few years, we've really looked at the rest of the chain. And if you go to the next slide, looked at actually what can we do for Broadway as a local street? What does it mean as a corridor that connects 5 unique neighborhoods, spans 5 different business improvement districts? What does it mean to connect and really continue to rebalance this corridor for pedestrians and cyclists? Next slide. So for us, that really meant moving away from the binary and away from having a street that's either open or closed, street or plaza, and really create an expanded gradient of tools, things like shared streets where we could introduce chicanes and self-enforcing slow speeds. Next slide. Tools here where we actually reversed a direction of Broadway for a block and really tried to design and introduce bikes as a kind of key user and key component along this block with our bike share stations. Next slide. Also thinking about our corridors as much stronger bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, and designing these streets for greater kind of organization of bikes and pedestrians, especially where we had incredibly high volumes of all users. Next slide. Also thinking about how we could start to use the space differently at different times of the year. So seasonally in the summer, when a lot of people are outside of the city and vehicle volumes are lower, weather is nicer, how can we make sure our streets are being used for people at that peak time, really more precisely managing our streets. And in the next slide, managing our streets for when we also have peaks in the winter times. Those seesaws are getting in 2 presentations, very popular, but having activity and places for people to connect when we have a lot of tourists in the city as well. Next slide. And so this kind of looks at our gradient approach, a kind of toolkit, looking at blocks from, what is the new base block? What is the new safe street? Making sure that we have shortened pedestrian crossings, traffic calming elements, places for green, as well as protected cycling infrastructure. This is the new normal. And really going up from there, slow blocks, again, where we can kind of build in that chicane and additional pedestrian space while still allowing for loading, pickup and deliveries, drop-offs, our shared space where we're able to create that kind of flush, cohesive space, building line to building line, that might be very amenable to kind of close down for events and pedestrianize for certain times of the day. Yet at other times it can be open again for critical deliveries and other types of movement, emergency lanes, things like that. And then ultimately, our plaza block and where we can continue to carve out pedestrian space, because as you start to change the corridor, the overall nature of the corridor changed. So Broadway pre-plazas, we saw about 1,500 vehicles in the peak hour. After we made the changes along the corridor, created plazas, we saw vehicle volumes drop anywhere from 250 vehicles in the kind of peak hour all the way down to 150 vehicles. So anticipating that as you make change, there will be kind of larger change to continue to be responsive to over time. And then the next slide shows just how each of these strategies can begin to tie together other initiatives and making space for, again, kind of continued pedestrian and bicycle priority, whether it be bike share, electrical vehicle charging, cargo bike parking, all of these things that are really going to carry us into a more sustainable, but also more pedestrian and bicycle friendly future. Next slide. And this also, this kind of toolkit approach gives us the ability to begin to make change along the corridor in a kind of paint by numbers approach. So next slide, really taking, where are places along the corridor that are ready, where change is really going to be meaningful, and where we should kind of wait and bring change, whether it be, we have a huge district right now along Broadway where we have massive hotels that are under construction, not a time, both because there are, cement trucks on the street, but also, a lot of those blocks are going to be changing. Use is going to be dramatically different. So it's not quite the right moment to dramatically change the street, but we have a set of tools that will be ready to deploy as portions of the corridor evolve. Next slide. So as we were kind of working on this toolkit and getting ready to implement a whole host of kind of more corridor-wide improvements, we all went remote and took a pause in March of last year. And my team got right to work thinking about how we can take all of our community partnerships and ways of using the public space and create programs that would help New Yorkers be able to get outside, mental health, socially distance, as well as ways we could help all of the businesses, particularly the struggling restaurant industry in New York City. And so we worked with a whole kind of city team, as well as a whole host of partners across the city to create an open streets program where we had a time of day management to allow people to get out, to walk, open restaurants. We have over 10,000 restaurants participating in using streets and sidewalks for outdoor dining, as well as open streets restaurants, which is a great combination of the two that you see here in this picture, where we pedestrianize streets at certain times of the day and really create an amazingly vibrant and yet still socially distant space for use. And so really an amazing moment, next slide, where we saw people recognize that this our streets and this space that we share was so much more valuable than using it for cars. We also saw, and particularly for us in New York, the restaurant industry pour their hearts and souls into keeping their businesses open, trying to strengthen their communities and really create an amazing environment on the streets. Next slide. And so many communities who hadn't been empowered before to make public space changes because they didn't have the maintenance capacity were much better prepared to simply put out a barricade on their street, this kind of light touch. And so as we kind of look at our toolkit, really the pandemic helped put this like much lighter touch time of day management, developed it at warp speed, and now we see it as a very active layer to how we transform public spaces moving forward. But certainly the pandemic, with all of its challenges, along with the overlay of the racial justice movement, we saw that an element that was used to connect communities was just as used to separate communities. And really an amazing moment and a really important moment for us to look at our work. We were afforded this privilege of really great high capacity partners along Broadway to kind of iterate and create these tools. But we also know there are so many communities that are struggling and have not been afforded the same opportunities. And so for us, it is all the more important to go back. And as we look at rolling out this kind of spectrum of and gradient of public space tools in the future, go to the next slide. We think that really fundamentally, we need to be starting from who are these streets for? How are we designing our streets to be inclusive and open, and just as much as who these streets are for, that really plays into the next slide about who manages these streets, because it is the people who are stewarding their streets that are making these streets relevant in various communities. And so how do we kind of take these really important questions and have very honest conversations as we move these designs forward, and again, not only in the places of privilege in our city, but also in the communities that are in such need and have been underserved for so long. So thank you, and with that, we'll turn it over to our last panelist.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Fantastic. I think that's a yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So first, I just want to apologize. We just moved, And someone just showed up to mow our lawn who we don't know, but I think was the previous homeowner. So if you hear any background noise, that's what that is. But I'm happy to be here, and we can head to the first slide. Just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, what my company is, and then why we should be talking about equity in all we do, and what you can do as individuals, and especially as you're thinking about this project, which has the potential to be transformative, and which we all want to be transformative. As my colleagues have already talked about, there are many considerations you have to make, both on the technical front, on the engagement front, and really on the process front. But really thinking about kind of taking a step back and thinking about some bigger picture things. So with that, I will tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Tamika Butler, and I used to work at Tool Design with many of the folks on this call, as was mentioned during my intro. And I got into this work because I care about connecting people and places to the things they want to do and see. And I started that work off being the executive director of the LA County Bicycle Coalition. It was very different than being a civil rights lawyer like I was doing before this. But I think it is more fun. And for a lot of folks, I really think it's more tangible. And part of why I got into this work is because as a lawyer, I very quickly realized that the people I was trying to help get access to civil rights they needed, if they couldn't get there, if they didn't have reliable transportation, if public transit wasn't available, if their route to walk to my legal clinic, wasn't something that they could do, then what good were my legal services? And so as we think about why we should be thinking about equity and transportation, because really transportation is the through line to all that we should be doing. And that's why I started my own company, Tamika L. Butler Consulting. And it's really about how do we focus on, yes, we might show up to be the transportation folks or the parks folks or whatever it may be, but all of these issues are intermingled and intersect. And on the next slide, when I talk about why this matters, the reason why is because everything matters. And so from the very beginning, when we talked about civil rights and transportation, race mattered. Talking about race, and when I say equity, I often mean racial equity. Talking about race mattered. And that is true for we live in a country that was started by stealing land from indigenous people. As one of my colleagues talked about parks, we have a national park system that was started by stealing land from people, putting up fences around it, and then telling them they couldn't get in. And even today, when you look at data for many national park services, those national park visitor demographics are reflective of an exclusionary system, and it's because of who feels welcome where. And so when we think about transportation, we should be thinking about race. If we click again, we should be thinking about race and how that interacts with how people feel like they can move when we think about incarceration, when we think about the environment. If you care about environmentalism, then you should care about environmental racism. We should care about which communities are zoned to do what, and where toxic and hazardous land use is okay, and who do we deem is expendable. And then last but not least is schools, right? Again, all of these things are tied. We might just show up to a meeting thinking about transportation, but for many of the people we want to serve, they're thinking about all the ways that equity and racism and discrimination have impacted their lives. And again, if we click, this really came up during the last year. During the last year, when more and more people were talking about uprisings and race, we saw a number of books, White Fragility, How to Be an Anti-Racist. We saw a number of books go back onto the New York Times bestseller. And this was one of those books, The Color of Law. And if you haven't read this book, I think anybody who cares about this work, this is a great book. And it really talks about the history of redlining. But what I'm gonna talk about is, as I keep going, you're gonna hear me talk about whiteness. And the reason I talk about whiteness is because if we care about equity work, we have to also care about centering whiteness. And we have to know what it means when we show up and we say we care about equity, but we still center whiteness. And The Color of Law is a perfect example. It's a book that cares about equity and racism. It talks about how government segregated America. but just because you care about it doesn't mean you're not still centering whiteness. And so when you say the title of your book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, that is a white-centered view, because maybe white people have forgotten about how government segregated America, but people of color haven't. As I said, we just bought a home. I haven't forgotten that my home is something that no one in my family could have ever imagined. I can't forget about the lack of generational wealth. I can't forget about how my dad grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, in the projects in a community divided by a highway, full of history, the birthplace of Malcolm X, but that still faces segregation. And so again, even if we care about something and we have the best intent, like this incredible book, we have to think about the language we use when we show up in those spaces, because saying something is forgotten or saying, well, we want to do things differently, we've just never thought about it like this before, or we've never tried this, or we've never had to think about this. You have to constantly ask yourself, who's we? If we go to the next slide, sometimes when I say this, I get a look like, wait, what? How, why are you talking about race? Why do we have to do this? And hopefully this is present in everyone's mind, but if we go to the next slide, we should have always been talking about this for all of the historical things I talked about, but especially now we have to talk about this, right? Especially now, this is an issue. We have two pandemics. We have racism and COVID-19. And then if we go to the next slide, we're literally living in two different worlds. We're living in a world where some of us are just out in the street asking for folks to see our dignity, to value our lives. And other folks are more concerned about, how are we going to rearrange and reallocate our streets and our public space so that people can eat outside? But who gets to eat outside? Who's welcomed outside, right? Again, when we have these issues, we also have to think about how we're centering whiteness. Now we want to think about how we allocate sidewalk space, which I think is great and which I think we should do. But we don't want to acknowledge that when it gets cold outside in some winter cities and they put up their igloos and they put up their tents, we're saying that if you can afford to pay to be here, then sitting on the sidewalk and being in this tent and keeping yourself warm is okay. However, if you're homeless and we, those of us in power, again, if we deem that you're an eyesore or that you make people feel unsafe, then we may have to clear the way of you, right? And we have to remember that streets and sidewalks, these are public spaces. I used to work at a parks organization. I used to run an organization that built parks and gardens. And even I knew that in a lot of cities, as much as I wanted to change that and make everyone have access within 5 minutes to a park, streets are some of our largest natural resources, or not so natural, right? Like that's where people are going. And so if we go to the next slide, and again, we have to be willing to engage in planning practices that are really going to decenter whiteness. And you're going to hear me saying that over and over again, and not because I don't think folks can get it, but because it's just so important. I have to keep saying it. When we engage in planning practices that center whiteness, we may believe that we're planning in a way that includes basic perspectives and experiences, when in reality, we're just planning based on experiences of place and space that are only afforded to those who are able to experience those places and spaces in white bodies, or in able bodies, or in male bodies, right? And we have to think about how this disconnect is manifested. It happens if we go to the next slide when we talk about slow streets, right? Slow streets, safe streets, and other city programs, they might be started to reduce or prohibit vehicle traffic speed. And the intentions are pure and they're good, right? We want to repurpose underused public space for recreational good. We want to slow down fast moving cars and keep folks safe. And during a pandemic, we want people to be able to get out when they're isolated in their houses. But these perspectives and these programs only really considered certain populations' relationship with the public realm. So if we go to the next slide and we think about the omission of racialized, oppressed, and marginalized experience, it's going to be glaring, especially in a year where you have, one Black man killed for jogging in Georgia. And that made many of us think back to another Black man killed while walking with Skittles. And let's not even talk about George Floyd, the video that I still haven't been able to watch, where you see a man gasping for his last breath, calling out for his dead mother with a green bike lane in the background, right? And so just because we have good intentions, if we don't understand that people have radically divergent experiences when we're talking about public spaces, and if we don't begin to question that just because we have a program and we call it Safe Streets, we have to consider safe for whom. We really, really have to start thinking about these things more intentionally. And if we go to the next slide, you might be wondering, okay, so how do we do that? So the first thing that we do is we have to realize that there's difference between having power over people and power with people. I always use the slide because I'm from the Midwest, and in the Midwest, we used to love Kanye, not so much anymore. But Kanye has a song where he says, no one man should have all that power. And as we do this work, often we think of power as something that we can centralize or decentralize, but hoard, and a kind of how do we leverage that over people? And if we really want to do equity work, we have to stop thinking in a colonial way about how we empower people, how only certain few of us have that power to bestow upon people, especially as fancy planners who come in to save the day. And we have to start thinking about how we can have power with people. How do we co-power them? How do we help them realize their vision? One of the ways we do that on the next slide is think about engagement, not outreach. We use these words interchangeably in our field, and we have to stop. Outreach is really just going out and saying, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? Here are some stickers. Tell us what you like. Engagement is going out and saying, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? And being open to the fact that people may say, I don't want that. I don't want to just tell you what I think. I don't want that. And we have to be honest. And if what we have to say is, well, our government funding says we have to do this, but we have to engage and be open to hearing from people. And part of the way to do that on the next slide is incorporate equity through partnerships. And we have to think about how we define and commit to equity early. Get everybody on the same page about what we mean. Equity is like the color blue. Are we talking about navy? Are we talking about sky blue? Are we talking about aqua? Get on the same page when you define it and you commit to it. Identify what the barriers are going to be, what the pressure points are going to be, and don't wait for a crisis. Don't wait for another Black person to die. Don't wait for the economy to fall off a cliff to start developing these partnerships, because the people who are going to survive will have had the partnerships long before. And in those partnerships, they will understand the capacity that their partners have because they will talk about it. And community members won't just be people you check in with and consult, they'll actually be leads. And when we do that on the next slide, that's when we can start thinking about the difference between equality and equity. And a lot of people think about this picture, and it's helpful if you're a visual person, but we have to get beyond this picture to the next slide. And we have to realize that the reality of where folks start is very different than that last slide allows us to hold space for. And where we should be trying to get is very different than that last space holds place for. Whether or not you're talking about public health or transportation, when we talk about doing equity work, we should want people to be free. We should want them to have clean air so they can breathe freely. We should want them to be able to get to the places that they want to go, the people they want to see, the resources they need freely. And that's how we truly do equity work. We move towards liberation, but beyond that, we go back to that slide on power. And we acknowledge that even this slide is a little limited because we have to let folks have some self-determination. Who has the power to decide that what they want to do is watch a baseball game? Maybe they don't. Maybe they want to coach the team. Maybe they want to own the team. Maybe they're budding entrepreneurs and they want to sell peanuts in the stand and get an exclusive contract with the whole league. But at some point, we have to be willing to listen to people and really let them guide what liberation looks like for them. And I'll just end by saying that in order to do that, we have to also have institutional change, as I talk about on the next slide. We have to be able to have institutional change by really thinking about our own processes. So we've talked about some of the outcomes we want to get to, and we've even talked about how we want to get to those income with people. But first, we have to create spaces in our project teams, in our organization, in our departments, in our friendships, and our communities where we can have brave conversations. Too often people want safe spaces, but as a Black person in America, I'm never safe. And so if we really want to do this, we have to be brave to know we're going to say some things wrong, we're going to make some mistakes, but we're going to keep going, we're going to keep trying, and we're going to be brave enough to acknowledge what we don't know, but not let that scare us so that we become silent, but that we keep pushing. And then again, we have to talk about power. You shouldn't be talking about equity if you're not talking about power. The simplest way to do this in any project, in any infrastructure, in any decision you're trying to make is ask yourself, who stands to be most impacted by this? And then look around the decision-making table and say, are they here? And if they're not there, then you have a power imbalance. And then you have to analyze and challenge who had the privilege to be here and why? Who had the privilege to create the data and the resources that we look at and we value? Who has the privilege to be thought of as an expert? Being at the table doesn't mean did we just consult them and can we pull the notes from that public meeting, but are they actually part of the decision making? Are they here and are we sharing our power? And so if you take away nothing else from this, think about the fact that as we do this work, as we bring together what all of us panelists have said, you constantly have to be thinking about who has power and who is most impacted. And as much as we can't allow those to continue to be different groups of people. I'll go ahead and end with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Those are all incredible presentations, and I have probably way too many questions, so I'll try to make sure that we can get to some of the key ones here. I'll try to start off with a potentially easy question for everyone. So we know that it takes a lot of collaboration to create great public spaces, and I wanted to hear from each of you who your project champions were in one of your projects and what impact you think that they've had throughout the project and then also after implementation and operation of the project. And I believe that Tamika and Emily may be muted as well.
Okay. I sent the little ask to unmute thing, but I'll try that.
Vanessa, I can jump in if you want me to, and then.
Sure.
So Project Champion, I think, is an incredibly important idea, and they come from a variety of places, but every project needs one. You simply need someone who won't take no for an answer. And generally, I shouldn't say normally, in many instances, that person is outside of the city, but has partners within the city, within the planning department, the transportation department, the economic development department, lots of different ways to bring this idea along. But if it's nurtured in the civic space, it can function quickly, and bureaucracy, again, don't take no for an answer. For Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, that idea has been around probably 40 years. The moment the city decided that the highway was going to separate this community and create an uptown and a downtown, the city knew it had to do something to heal that wound, but it didn't for years. When the idea came about to do something differently, to create a vibrant downtown, Dallas had a dried up downtown. I mean, people would get out of town as fast as they could at 5 o'clock. And so one of the ways to try to prevent that, lots of different ideas, the real estate sector, private citizens that were willing to put their money where their mouth was, all came together around this common idea. And it wasn't just a single leader, but ultimately it was a nonprofit that was formed to work with the city to get the park built. And that was the public-private partnership.
That's great.
Yeah, something I often say is that in a lot of planning work, people like planning work because it doesn't feel political. And in many ways, it's not. Like, people on either side of the aisle love walking and bikes and parks. But all of us who do this work know it's extremely political in the sense that there could be a lot of people who say yes to a particular project, but it only takes one person to say no to completely shut it down. And so as a result, part of finding a champion is so important, because you know there's going to be someone trying to shut it down. And so often the way that turns up is people with more privileges and resources to show up at meetings and to be a thorn in the side. You know, planning work is no different than Yelp. People who have the most time write the negative reviews. Like it's the same thing. And so by building champions, and again, you can do that through partnership with community groups. You have folks who are invested, and you have folks who aren't just fighting for something because you as a person working on the project says this is going to be good for you, but because they feel some ownership, like they helped shape it. They were out there knocking on the doors. They were out there talking to people. They see their idea reflected. They know that they picked the color of the slide for the park. They know that they were looking at, you know, a poster board of different type of native plants, and they got to talk about which ones they thought looked better and more meaningful to them. So building champions is also about building partners and building that shared ownership in a project.
This is Amalia. I just want to add that from my experience on Bell Street is that some of the champions are gone, but I think being open to finding new champions and the evolution of a space, you may not even be able to consider what the champions are right now. I think for at the inception of Bell Street, it was that they needed more open space. And so how thinking outside the box is like, well, let's get parks to pay for some improvements that really the DOT should be paying for, but the reality is that they're not. And then again, about the operations and the programming of it, like what does this mean? And to Tamika's point, who is it for and who's making those decisions? Where Bell Street is located, there is a lot of rental units in that area. And so that was something that I think that kind of checking back in, and to Tara's point, like this is something that is not static. This is dynamic. This has to change over time. And operationally, that operation budget and the maintenance budget is equally as important as the design budget. For those of you that saw my presentation on Bell Street, unfortunately, the maintenance budget has been cut because of shifts for COVID and the pandemic spending. And many of the businesses have gone out of business. And so there's not even the adjacent pair to the street. And I think this is going to be a time where we're going to have a shift of who's going to start to activate that space next. Who's that next group that's going to be?
And I'll just chime in at the end here to say, you know, it's always been our community partners that have convinced their neighbors. It's never been like our planning maps or numbers, right? It's always neighbors convincing neighbors. But I think also to a good point Tamika made about power, depending on what neighborhood we're in, there are oftentimes people, you know, property owners, real estate interest that drive a lot of the narrative. And so being able to have folks on the ground and be able to collect information from the users who's actually using the space has been a hugely important tool for us in a lot of our work. And over the past few years, DOT has built a street ambassador team, a group of folks who are super well versed in everything that the agency does. They speak many different languages, and they're out on the street talking to people who are actually using the space. Certainly COVID has been a big challenge to that, but trying to convert and translate that digitally so that it's not just the people who have the time or have the connection that can provide the feedback, but it is actually being able to gather numbers and a larger set of voices and being able to present that as part of the conversation.
That's great. Yeah, we've definitely found that it does only take one person to shut something down. And so it really is great to hear that, you know, having community leadership and partners outside of the city has been helpful for your projects as well. Tamika, I wanted to ask you, you know, we were talking earlier this afternoon about vulnerable populations and, you know, what the role of Peachtree, the Peachtree corridor should be in this redesign to addressing the needs of people experiencing homelessness. Do you have any recommendations on how public spaces can better support vulnerable populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tough, right? I hate to offer advice on this coming from LA because we're clearly not getting it right. But I do think that the first most basic step is we have to stop thinking of people experiencing homelessness as those people. And we have to start thinking of them as neighbors. We have to start thinking of them as valuable parts of the community. So in the same way, we might ask an older adult what they need, and they might say, you know, I need more benches to sit on. We have to also ask folks experiencing homelessness, what do you need? And they might say, benches without a bar in the middle so that I can lay down. They might say, you know, more trees because it gets really hot in the summer and I want more shade. And so I think we have to be open to the fact that that tree is going to give more shade to everybody. That bench that doesn't have a bar in the middle, like, sure, somebody might sleep there, but somebody might sit there with their 2 kids and not have to have the bar between them as you're trying to give them goldfish and stop a meltdown, right? Like, and so I think we have to start realizing that folks who are experiencing homelessness are still very much a part of our community. And beyond that, they're a part of our community who see and know a lot of things, right? People experiencing homelessness can tell you where there needs to be more light. People experiencing homelessness can tell you, you know, the parts of a park that don't feel safe, the parts where things are happening that you need to know about, where the kids are getting hurt on the playground. They can tell you that because they're there and they're watching it. And we have to balance, you know, making people feel safe and making, you know, people feel like they can enjoy a public space with who are we trying to make sure they can enjoy? Who's feeling safe? And so I really think we just have to humanize folks and engage them in the process as much as anybody. And then I think we also have to think not just about those partnerships with community-based organizations, but what are the other departments of government that theoretically should be in this with us? And so it's not just us showing up as transportation planners, our parks and rec. It's how do we show up with social workers? How do we do this? And how do we get just as engaged in this larger conversation about how we provide services, not just policing, for folks who are experiencing homelessness, especially now when we see more people losing their jobs and losing their homes.
One of the things that's happening in Seattle is that it's to Tamika's point, what happens after, what services are available, because of the fact of the matter is if you're doing a project and you're at construction and there's people who are actively living in the space you're constructing, it's not safe for them to be there. So it's equally as important in your process to think, okay, so there are people that are currently experiencing homelessness and they are effectively living within our project area. What will happen to them during construction and how long will that be impacted and where did they go and what services are available to them at that time? I have a project right now that was an active challenge. Like we needed to bring the bulldozer in to move the earth, and there were people that were living there, and so that's a really key part of really the implementation that needs to be considered.
We something we've been working on as part of our Plaza program is, you know, our whole program was based on public-private partnership, and we found very quickly that that led to inequity, and we had prioritized creation of public spaces across New York City and prioritized places that lacked open space and low to moderate income neighborhoods. But, you know, as we started to look at our map of plazas, we realized, oh, this is a map of where there's institutional capacity to take care of these spaces, not where the spaces are actually most needed. So we created a partnership with a couple of really great organizations that are workforce development, both formerly incarcerated folks as well as formerly homeless folks, and have them steward and actually take care of the spaces. And the groups that we're working with, ACE New York and the Horticultural Society of New York, are also kind of continuing to evolve. They do a lot of outreach in the space to try to get people in the neighborhood engaged in their programs. And so we can start to, again, shift the idea of, oh, these are people we need to get out of our spaces, to thinking about our public spaces as, again, the town square, the place where people come to get help, the place where everybody that everybody can use in whatever way they need it. And so, cities starting to make connections and draw, hey, we need maintenance. How can that create jobs for, the people who need it most, and make it part of a larger solution? And we heard about that today at the walking tour about kiosks with social workers in them. Again, how can we think about our public spaces as hubs for resources, as spaces for where can people come and find out about how to get a New York City ID if you don't have documentation? How can you find out about getting your COVID vaccine? These public spaces in our communities are huge assets, and how do we make them greater, more relevant resources for everyone?
Thank you so much. Those were amazing answers. And I had follow-up questions, but I don't think we have time for all of them. So I'll try to move us to another topic of active management. Tara, you talked about active management being crucial for active spaces, and that requires funding and dedicated staff. And can you tell us a little bit about how you got philanthropic community excited about the project, and also what are some sustaining organizations that should be in place to ensure long-term stewardship?
Well, I think that is a multifaceted question and a really important one. And I think maybe I'll take it in bite-sized pieces. Organizations that could get involved for stewardship, philanthropic organizations, there could be an opportunity for grants, foundation support. That takes a dedicated effort. That takes someone who is willing to do that research and to write the grant. But it is a good source of income, especially when you have identified what's the message, what's the value proposition, what's the case for support, why this space is important to Atlanta. And Tamika has done an outstanding job outlining the social impacts, the equity, the justice, the piece to it. It's also a health and wellness component. There's a lifestyle and an active lifestyle, and what that can do for children. And just, kids in America spend 8 hours a day in front of a screen. We need to they only have about 30 minutes a day in unstructured play, if that. What can green space do to get kids moving? So I think you have to identify what is your case for support? Who are the entities that you could talk to? Or could there be corporations that could help fund this space? And then the flip side of this is who operates the space. Are there partnerships that could exist already? Is there a management entity that could take this on? I love the workforce development idea. I think that is brilliant. Who is doing good work already that you might be able to leverage, and you offer them a brand new opportunity that they didn't even know existed that could help you take care of this space? It's the same thing with arts organizations to help you activate and program it. They're there. Can they bring their activities, their skills, their talents to life in the space? And can you incentivize them to do so by offering them a flat fee or some kind of payment structure so that they have the authorship and the ownership to do that? They're a hired entity. So it's kind of lifting it from multiple sides. But at the end of the day, you got to create an authentic solution that's unique to Atlanta. There is no prescriptive formula that says thou shalt do it this way and it will work. You have to find partnerships and create authenticity for this space, leveraging the professional and the volunteer resources that are available to you. But there's a lot of different ways to drive revenue to build it. There's a lot of different ways to drive revenue to operate and maintain it. And I think you need an entrepreneurial approach to both to get it done. It's not going to happen if the city is asked to do it by themselves. No offense to any city out there. They've got so much on their plate. There is so much demand for their time and their attention and those general fund dollars. But bringing the city an opportunity that is a partnership, that is some kind of division of labor and responsibility, I think is more palatable and could get done a lot faster.
No offense taken.
I'm trying to defend the city. You've got a lot on your plate.
We all do. And speaking of that, you know, Amali, you mentioned in the Park Lane project in Kirkland how stormwater infrastructure was also functioning as a safe condition for pedestrians. So in your experience, how do various city departments or even other partners, as we've just been talking about, need to collaborate on a shared space to ensure that it's functional across multiple aspects and is well integrated?
I think I'm going to stay within the maintenance vein. I think one of the things that's really critical is the maintenance of it. Everyone can come in and design it. It's a little less subjective to say, you know, we've done these calculations that can manage this much stormwater. We've done the calculations, we can manage this much traffic. We've done the calculations, we can have this much space allocated pedestrians. All of that stuff can be less subjective, or can be subjective. It's the who is going to maintain it and how sustained is that resource and who's being brought to the table. I think that's the key piece. The Kirkland project was a smaller city, so that was a little bit easier for them to work. I think right now I'm working with the city of Seattle in their GSI program, and maintenance is the sticking point of all of the implementation that they want to do. Whether it's going to be a neighbor, I've sat in meetings where they said we cannot put that facility in that neighborhood because it is too difficult to maintain because those people do not care about their environment. And like, we have to move away from that acknowledgement. I mean, we have to acknowledge that that is kind of an institutional thought in some cities. And I think one of the things I wanted to highlight about New York was that they have really just said, we're going to put in what we can, we're going to maintain what we can. They have a workforce program related to maintenance, and it can be done about thinking outside the box. I think this idea about the who is going to take care of it and what is its ultimate function is really key to the success and should be considered as part of the design.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I know that we're at our time, so if you have to leave, please feel free to leave. But if our panelists are okay with going over a couple more minutes, maybe we can get to one or two more questions. Does that sound okay? Awesome. Speaking of New York, Emily, I really enjoyed hearing you share about Broadway. When the Atlanta City Studio first looked at Peachtree Street, Broadway was our case study, both because of the length of the corridor, but also how its primary function changes throughout Manhattan. And Peachtree does the same thing through Atlanta as it turns from Peachtree Street to Peachtree Road, going north, and particularly looking at the local treatments focused on the residents' needs, I think was really interesting. What are some physical design features that you believe draw people to use a space, to use street as public space?
I think for us, one of the newest and I think most exciting tools that we are using is the chicane, which allows for self-enforcing slow speeds of vehicles. And I think that makes a street feel better for everyone. That is something that before the pandemic, we had been kind of testing and using and thinking like, is this going to make our streets too inflexible? Thinking about micromobility kind of ramping up, and do we need to think about just, much larger cycling lanes? And, are these chicanes going to make cause more problems for us in the future? But as we did see during the pandemic, with vehicle volumes dramatically reduced, we saw a lot more speeding, and with less pedestrians on the street overall, it didn't feel safe for everyone. So again, while it is a specialized treatment and not something that can be used and is appropriate everywhere, we do think it has, a whole lot of value when you're looking to identify kind of what are these key corridors that people use in their neighborhood, where we want to be, fostering very strong pedestrian and cyclist connections, because overall it just creates a much calmer environment that really just feels better for everyone. And then I would certainly say, I mean, another big thing that we see across the board is movable furniture, having an element that people can choose. They can choose to sit with a group, they can choose to sit alone, they can choose to sit in the sun, they can choose to sit in the shade. That being such a huge key, again, giving the choice to the user in many ways to make the space what they need it to be. Unfortunately, movable furniture needs a lot more maintenance than just a bench on the street. And so, we see that in our spaces, in some of our kind of spaces with less maintenance capacity. A lot of times it's, just some benches and a bike rack, and it's fine. But the quality is just, that slightly less, and the interactivity slightly less. So I think that for us also is a reason to really try to, as much as possible, support the maintenance of these spaces where there isn't capacity, because we want to be delivering a quality kind of across the board for kind of all neighborhoods.
Yeah. Well, maintenance definitely sounds like a huge deal for everyone. I did want to ask one last question, which was one that I skipped in the beginning, but I think it's really important. I wanted to talk about that drawing, Tamika, that you were showing of the people trying to watch baseball. Part of the challenge that we've heard from underrepresented communities is that a lot of those leaders in those communities can often be spread too thin and don't have, the luxury of as much free time as white counterparts. Do you have any recommendations on how we can better support our partnerships? I feel like even in the partnerships, sometimes there is inequality, and inviting people in the same way doesn't always mean that you're going to be able to engage in an equitable way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason I talk so much about process is because so often folks want to just get to equity, right? And they just want to start doing things equitably. But if we haven't taken the time to look at processes and the way we do things, then we're just perpetuating systems of inequity or white supremacy or centering different things. And so we really have to take that step back and say to ourselves, how can we do this, and how can we acknowledge that there is a power dynamic, and rather than feeling guilty about that and shutting down, how can we actively work to fix it? The most important thing is to pay people. It's just like, I think having equitable community partnerships takes a lot of work, and it can be really complicated, and it can be really hard, and you have to hold space and time for history and atonement and all of those things that I will not pretend are easy. But there's an easy part: paying people. Like, it's just pay people, have food, have childcare, right? Like, and make things accessible language wise. And that's both not speaking planner speak, but if you have some community members who are going to show up and they're going to be monolingual Spanish speakers, they shouldn't be the only ones wearing headphones. Make everybody wear headphones. Like, how do you create these spaces? And I think that the sooner we get to a point where we realize that we're more than happy to pay a consultant to do X, Y, and Z at this rate an hour, but we actually, like, the folks who actually have expertise, who have the lived experience, we should value that expertise. We should value that time. And now more than ever, if we want folks to show up and offer their opinions at a time when offering an opinion to us might mean not working that extra shift, might mean not getting some extra sleep at a time that is stressful, then we have to make it worth folks' while. And so I really, really think paying is important. And then I also really, really think it's important to close loops with people. Come back, tell them how you use their feedback. How didn't you use their feedback? Why? And really make sure that again, folks don't feel like they're just, getting information sapped from them and taken from them, but that they're engaging in an interactive process. And even if their suggestions aren't taken, hey, at least they got paid for it and got like a hot meal, right? And I think that's super straightforward.
Thanks so much.
The other thing I think that we find is that being prepared to answer questions that may not be directly related to the project. So people are going to come and say, this is something that is concerning to me. It's tangentially related. So rather than saying this is not part of the project, like what can you do as a city or as the other agency to help them find out how to go that path. I think breaking down those barriers, like I find them, I am very privileged. I have trained background, and still like navigating some of these city processes can be really difficult. So being prepared to provide those resources as well, even though they may not be directly related.
Yeah, we've
Yeah, I
definitely
just want to, I want to second that. It's so critical because so many things happen in public space and on our streets. We find that as we're talking to people, it's always about many other really important issues. And so being able to get people information, but then also channel what you hear to other folks who may be able to help is like a huge challenge, but a really important one.
Well, thank you everyone for participating and letting us learn from your experience and have this conversation together. I thought it was incredible, and we'll probably listen to this again to make sure I didn't miss anything. I did want to wrap it up since we are a little bit over, and I don't know if I'm supposed to pass it to someone to just wrap it up and give some more information about the project. You
Sure,
can go.
I can share.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, no problem. So thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here with us to learn from everyone. And I know we're all going to be continuing to digest this. So you probably have seen our project website since you found your way to the registration link for this. But sharepeachtree.com has information. It also has the ways that you can contact us through either the contact form or the project email address, which is peachtree@atlantagaga.gov. So feel free to check back here and we'll keep that feedback loop updated and let you know how we've been using your feedback. We have a couple of other events happening this week that we'd love for you to participate in and to have anyone else in your communities to join us. They're going to be a little bit more interactive and collaborative than this one. So we hope to see you there. Tomorrow night, we'll have an open house about the demonstration project, which like Emily was referencing, we'll be taking some of those shorter term, lower cost tactical approaches to test some of the ideas of the shared space and actually see something on the ground this year. So we're excited to roll out those initial designs and get some collaborative input on what that might look like, who some of those organizations or partners might be to help us program it, all that kind of stuff. And then thinking more on the permanent side of the shared space, on Wednesday, we'll be hosting our community open studio, which will be like if you've ever been to a meeting where you can sit and like draw with the designers and that kind of thing, an opportunity for you to really take a close look at what some of the initial design concepts are specific to Peachtree Street and throw darts at them, let us know what you like or don't like, or where you have an idea for something to be different. It'll be a super informal session that we really see that as being like co-designing with you. So Wednesday night at 5 o'clock, that'll be happening. And then along the same vein, just if you've been imagining what the next iteration of Peachtree Street might look like, we'd love to see what's been in your mind. So whether it's a napkin sketch or if you've got, watercolor skills or whatever it might be, we'd love to see what you've been imagining for Peachtree Street. So feel free to send us your sketches or if you have like a picture of a space that you love or anything just as a visual reference, you can send those to the project email address, which is on the screen. It's peachtree@atlantagaga.gov, or you can tag at ATL Planning on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and we'd love to get those by this coming Sunday, so give you some weekend time to be thinking and dreaming about it, but so we can go ahead and incorporate those into the project concepts. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I see we've got a little bit in the chat with some contact information for speakers, which is awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Tamika. And thank you all so much for sharing your insight. I've found it to be a super interesting conversation. So big thanks to you. We'll be on for a few more minutes. If any folks have questions or comments, feel free to throw those in the chat and we'll take a look at those. So thank you. Okay, I see a comment in the chat about Centennial Olympic Park, which is a few blocks off of Peachtree Street. If anyone at the city wants to speak to this, sort of drop your name in the chat and I can unmute you. But my understanding is that there is currently a strategic plan going on for Centennial Olympic Park that will result in a number of different redesign elements, but that Centennial Olympic Park is actually not owned by the city of Atlanta. It's owned by the Georgia World Congress Center. So even
And
though go ahead,
and is
Addie.
not part of this study as well.
Right. Yeah. So another opportunity for public space downtown for sure, but that's actually one of the reasons why this initiative is happening is because it's not true that seemingly large public space is actually not truly public. As we saw this summer, Georgia World Congress Center was able to close it off and manage that privately. So we want to make sure that there is a comparable space that is truly public and that can be managed by the city. Separate initiative.
This panel discussion tonight and all the presentations will be public. They will be on the Share Peachtree website. If you go to Engage, you'll be able to find all the speakers' bios along with tonight's presentation.
Yep, definitely. And you'll see right now the recordings are up there for the last workshop that we held in November. We just have to process the recordings for this and get them up. So they'll be on there this week.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for
And
coming.
thanks, Matt, for that clarification in the chat.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank everybody for attending, and with no more questions I see popping up, we hope everyone has a great night, and we will see you hopefully tomorrow night and the following night. So thank you very much.
Thank you.